Hey guys, welcome to another episode of The Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick. Today, talking about the band Green Day and why they are one of the most hated bands in punk music. There's a bunch of links down below. You got links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlist that I put together every week, and the Patreon page. So make sure you check all that out. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button down below, and make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. So I first got into Green Day, it was probably right after Dookie came out, so I was probably about 14 years old. It was really the first time I ever listened to Dookie. I was hooked, and from there I would go back and fall in love with Kerplunk, and from there I would end up discovering bands like Rancid and got into Operation Ivy, and that got me into bands like the Ramones and the Clash. But it was really Green Day was the band that really got me into and started heading me down the path of the love of punk music that I've had for the last 30 plus years. And somehow, over the evolution of the band over the last 30 plus years, they've gone from being these darlings of punk rock in the middle part of the 90s to one of the most hated punk bands around. Because back in the 90s, I don't remember the band getting as much hate as they do now. And I don't know if it's because, the internet wasn't as big in the later part of the 90s, and that really kind of amplifies everyone's voice, at least through social media. That didn't exist, 25, 30 years ago. I guess the one thing that always got me was the fact that people have always thrown out that tag that, they're not authentically punk, they're posers, they don't really belong in the scene. When Green Day came up in that Gilman Street, Berkeley scene in the late 80s with bands like Operation Ivy and The Offspring, and yes, they were signed to Lookout Records for their first couple of records, and then they ended up going to Reprise for Dookie. So they left an independent label and went to a major label. I understand that's where a lot of the hatred started coming from. And I think they were also banned from playing at Gilman because they signed it with that major label. But over the years, Green Day has done what every other major band has done, at least most of them, which is evolved musically. And Green Day has done that across their career. And, Dookie was a punk rock staple in the middle part of the 90s. Even with Insomniac, the band started growing a little more, adding some more influences into their music. And then by the time they would get to Warning and American Idiot, a lot of that punk rock stuff was gone and replaced with more kind of like straightforward rock, alternative rock, even though there was a lot more punk rock on American Idiot than what there was on Warning. And they're also a band that's been very outspoken politically, which that kind of pushes some people off also. And they've never really been afraid to push the envelope musically on their albums either. That's kind of what I want a band to do. If they're going to release 4, 6, 10 albums, I want them all to sound very different. And outside of like Kerplunk and Dookie, which both sound very similar, except for with Dookie having being a lot more of a polished album than Kerplunk, you really can't say that about any other album that Green Day has released across their career. And I think something else that really helped alienate some of their fan base was when they signed with Reprise and released Dookie, it became one of the biggest albums of the middle part of the 90s. And they were bigger than every other punk band that had existed before them. At least sales-wise, they were bigger than all the other ones. And once a band is labeled as a sellout, it's really hard to shake that, especially if you get that earlier in your career. Like I said, Dookie was their third studio album. They got labeled as sellouts because they went to Reprise, so they were labeled sellouts by a lot of the Gillen folk and a lot of their older fans. And really, regardless of what they do with the rest of their career, it's going to be hard to shake that. And then they release American Idiot, which is almost as big commercially as Dookie was. It's still like it just compounds year after year, album after album. There's also been a big backlash over the years against their style of punk. Whether you want to call it punk rock or pop punk, whatever you want to say, the punk purists have always looked at Green Day and bands like Green Day. Even though Green Day, it was a hugely influential band in the 90s and early 2000s, in lots of ways that those earlier bands in the 70s and early 80s really couldn't have been. A lot of purists look at their form of punk as too commercial, too overexposed. And in some ways, I understand the criticisms, because as punk got more popular in the 90s, it started getting a lot more airplay on radio and on MTV. And I understand that, like I said, people saw what Green Day was doing and what bands like Green Day were doing in the 90s and early 2000s. as watering down the sound from the 70s. But something I think that Green Day has done different from a lot of other punk bands from their era is a lot of other punk bands, you listen to album after album, they have that same really similar sound. And like I said earlier, Green Day has done a very good job of kind of breaking away from that mold, being more experimental with their albums as they've gone on throughout their career. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but at least they're willing to go out there and try something different than what they've done before. Because Green Day could have easily done Dookie and then done Dookie version 2 and Dookie version 3 and kind of kept going throughout the rest of their career like that. But they wanted to grow as musicians, they wanted to grow their sound, and that's exactly what they did with their albums. And once again, I can understand some of those criticisms because their version of punk rock was a little more simplified. And a lot of other bands in their era, in the mid 90s to early 2000s, a lot of bands had that very formulaic sound, but Green Day kind of started that whole formula, at least in the mainstream, in the 90s. My big criticism of Green Day, and one that I understand a lot of other people have out there, is their overexposure. And I didn't really feel like the band was overexposed until they released American Idiot in 2004. And then once American Idiot was released and went into the stratosphere and, sold, I don't know what it was, 12 or 15 million copies worldwide, it was a huge album. And then the band went off and did like a Broadway play and, started going down some other paths that, the whole ethos, or one of the founding ideal principles of punk rock has always been this DIY attitude. And with American Idiot, Green Day completely lost that. And speaking to that overexposure, I remember Billy Joe Armstrong did an interview, I think it was in like around the middle to late part of the 90s, where he was making fun of the Sex Pistols by, the Sex Pistols would go out there and brand anything to sell merchandise-wise. And Green Day has been doing the same thing. And you pretty much think of any product out there, Green Day has a version of it. Green Day has their own version of their own coffee brand also. Nothing screams punk rock like having your own Keurig cups. So that's one aspect of the criticism that I fully agree with. But once again, it doesn't, I don't think it impacts the quality of their music. And that's really what I care about. I don't really care about what they do with their personal lives. I don't care what they do with the band name and all the products that they try to sell. I just care about the music. And Green Day has had some very political albums. Think, American Idiot or 21st Century Breakdown. There was really strong political themes through both of those albums. I mean, American Idiot was basically an anti-George Bush album overall. So anyone that didn't agree with them politically was always going to have some kind of negative thoughts towards the band and towards those albums. And that's something else that I think kind of helped alienate some of their fans. But even at its core, even going back to the 70s, punk music has always been political. So people really shouldn't be surprised when Green Day comes out and takes a political stance. I have seen some criticisms thrown at the band simply because they don't like the way that Billy Joe Armstrong sings. And I completely understand that. There are lots, I shouldn't say lots, there are several really big high-profile bands and musicians over the last 50, 60 years that I cannot listen to. I know Rush is a beloved band, but I just can't get past Geddy Lee's voice. And I know there's people out there that have that same issue with Billy Joe. Something that I think really hurt the band was when they released their trilogy Uno, Dos, and Tre in 2012. And between those three albums, there's only a very small handful of songs that I thought were any good. They probably could have taken those three albums and made one album and it would have been a good release. But that just kind of goes back to the whole overexposure I think the band had. Those albums were bloated, they were unfocused, and that was really the only time in the band's career that they have had this like copying album to album sound, which I get it. It's all basically one big album, like a triple album broken up into three releases. But they should have trimmed that down, just made one album out of the whole thing. And I think it would have been better overall for the band. Something else that Green Day has struggled with over the years is having that like teen angsty kind of lyrics. When it's hard to have lyrics like that when you're in your mid to late 40s. And that's where bands like Blink-182 has had the same thing, the same kind of issues over their career. It's hard to kind of evolve your music and evolve your lyrics and not kind of fall back into those same styles that you were able to use and really made you popular, 20, 30 years ago. Something else that I've had issue with, and I don't really hold this against the band because they really had no control over it, was when they were inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I think it was 2015 when they went in. I think it was way too early. There were a lot of other, especially from punk rock, there were a lot of other punk bands that I think were way more deserving of it than Green Day. Like, I understand that Green Day was one of the most influential punk bands of the last 30 years, but there were some great influential bands going back to the early to mid part of the 70s that I think probably should have went in before Green Day, but that's not something I can really hold against the band. I think what really helped them get inducted so earlier in their career is the fact that, Dookie and American Idiot are two of the highest grossing punk albums of all time. And even though the band puts on some great, incredible live performances, I've seen them several times over the years, and they're always fantastic. They always put on a good show. Billy Joe Armstrong has had some antics on stage over the years that have also kind of helped alienate people. And the big one that comes to mind was the 2012 iHeartRadio Music Festival, where Billy Joe Armstrong had this huge meltdown on stage. I think he ended up smashing his guitar and saying a bunch of things about the producers of the festival, and kind of stormed off stage. And that really rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, even people that have been fans of the band for a very long time. And I know it's 2025 and a lot of people really don't even listen to the radio anymore, but over the course of the last 25 years, some of the more popular hits that Green Day have had that have been really kind of overplayed on the radio have not been the very best of their catalog. I understand that songs like Wake Me Up When September Ends and Boulevard of Broken Dreams had a lot of really big crossover appeal across the rock genre, but I don't think they were fair representations of what American Idiot was about. And really, the Green Day has had several instances of that over their career. Even going back to Nimrod with Good Riddance, where you had schools that had that as their senior theme song for several years after that album came out. And that's one of those songs where I think the popular thoughts and opinions of that song are very different than what the band's true intent lyrically was. And they had such a huge commercial run from with Dookie, with Insomniac, with Nimrod, with Warning, with American Idiot, that stretch of albums where every single album was huge commercial successes. And ever since American Idiot, I feel like the band has really kind of struggled capturing that magic again. Yes, they had some success with 21st Century Breakdown. Then they had the disaster, I think, that was the trilogy. They came back with Revolution Radio, which I think was nowhere close to, I think, what the height of the band was, but still a really good album in and of itself. And then Father of All was, I think, a complete disaster. I know there are people out there that love that album. I think there's a lot of people out there that look at it as easily the worst album the band ever put out. But it is an album that, the more I listen to it, I think there is some more redeeming qualities to it. It's not as horrible as I once thought it was. I mean, I still think it's the band's worst album, but then they come back with Saviors, and honestly, I thought it was probably the best album the band put together since American Idiot. So love them or hate them, it's really hard to argue with the influence the band has had over the last 30 plus years. Even if you don't like the band or like the music, it's hard to argue when you look at all the bands that the band has influenced after them. But then again, there's also criticism there that people will look at those bands that came out after them and say, look, those bands were influenced by Green Day instead of being influenced by the Sex Pistols, the Ramones, and all those bands that came out before them. And they kind of look at that, late 90s, early 2000s pop punk as, like I said earlier, a very watered down form of what the genre originally was. But I'm sure there's lots of people out there like me that Green Day was your entry point into punk music, especially, like I said, kids growing up in the early part of the 90s. Like I said, I got into Green Day. Green Day, I think Rancid was more of a gateway band than Green Day was, because by the time Rancid would release and Out Come the Wolves in 95, I think that was the point at which I really went back and started discovering all those 70s and 80s bands. So even though I have some pretty big issues with things that they've done across their career, both, on stage and on, in musically on their albums, I still love the band. They're still one of my favorite bands of all time. I'd probably put them in my top 10, which is down from where they used to be. I think before American Idiot, I probably would have had them in my top 4 or 5. But, like I said earlier, because of how down I've been on most of their post-American Idiot albums, they kind of slid down the list for me because of that. But that's all I got for you today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. Make sure you drop me a comment down below. I'd love to know what you guys think of this. What do you guys think of Green Day? What got you into the band, or what made you hate the band? And what are some things that you think are kind of overblown or maybe blown out of proportion that people use in kind of a negative way to hit the band with, the band really doesn't deserve? Because on a lot of them, I can kind of see both sides of it. I can kind of see the pros and the cons, but they're still a band I love. They're still a band that makes great music even today. Next time they're on tour, I'll probably go see them again. I've seen them multiple times over the years, but I don't know. Let me know what you guys think. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure to give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. That's all I got. Until next time, keep on spinning. Peace.